I think you're funny, Sonia.
Thank you. You hear that, Pittsburgh lady?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, she doesn't. Today's guest is Dinty W. Moore, whose latest collection, To Hell With It, of sin and sex, chicken wings, and Dante's entirely ridiculous, needlessly guilt-inducing Inferno, was released earlier this year.
Well, it's a peculiar book. There's no way around that. But it is a look at the concept of hell, the idea that there's an actual hell. And when I was a kid, that hell was deep within the earth. So presumably you could find a cave and go down there. Not that you'd want to, but the idea that there was an actual hell, that we would die in the state of sin and spend the rest of eternity suffering. It's complicated enough to think what that means as thinking adults who have to weigh the idea of who is God and why are we here and what does all this mean. But for a 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old kid, that's a pretty scary thing, especially since sin is rather capricious. You know, what is a sin? What isn't a sin? You know, the Catholic Church has the commandments, but there's always wiggle room. And then if you confess, or if you meant to confess, or if you sort of would have confessed if you'd had the time before the bus hit you, it just blew my mind as a kid. And now it blows my mind to think that so many kids are taught to believe that. The idea that many organized religions push at us that we are deeply flawed, and only through organized religion will we be saved or made pure or made holy. I don't reject religion entirely, but the sort of that part of organized religion, and I was raised Catholic, so a lot of my knowledge, so a lot of my specific complaints have to do with Christianity after Jesus was dead and gone. The Vatican was as much about politics and land and who ruled what country as it was about spreading the faith. I've just described 100 books. It's so that those ideas are so large, but it's my personal take on those things. How did being raised believing in hell, though even from the beginning I was kind of skeptical, how did being raised with the idea that I'm deep down inside flawed, how that influenced me, how that led to a lifetime of wrestling with depression, a lifetime of struggling with self-loathing. I'm at that point in my life where I'm looking backwards a little bit too often. And I think, my God, everybody I know has some level of self-loathing and depression in their lives. I'm contemplating how much these basic concepts of hell and sin had to do with it. Having said that, it's a funny book.
Yeah, it is a funny book. That's one of your gifts. There's so many in this book, so many things that you do that come at these very heavy topics. You just mentioned like hell, and even if we're not talking literal hell, but the idea of not being worthy or self-loathing, depression, death, all of that, right? But you come at it in these really interesting ways, not only through humor, but through, you have comics in that book, you have photographs, you do one of the sections that I love most, maybe because it gets to my thing, which is eating. Yeah, there we go.
I can remember very much when I started writing literary nonfiction, the essay, whatever you want to call it, hating my own writing because I sounded too serious and too lectury and who the heck am I to give opinions on important things. So as I struggled with that, I let my natural humor, and I am a person who likes to crack jokes and sees the world as a rather funny place. I let that seep in. Humor keeps us not taking life too seriously. The humor keeps us sort of willing to hear things we might not want to hear or think about things in fresh ways. But it also allows me an occasion to tackle something like not just my depression, but I mean, my parents were both very deeply depressed people. My parents were both orphaned, so I've never met any of my grandparents. But what I've been able to learn is that they were deeply dragged down by this hole of depression. So it allows me to sort of tackle these things without boring myself to death, and hopefully without boring the reader to death.
And I think humor I don't know, I've never like done a formal study of humor, but it seems to me like it suddenly perspective is like the doors are flung open and you see that there's a wider world out there. I
Right,
think that's how
right.
your humor works. You, the writer, or the camera, the lens just swings. And before we get too serious or start to over analyze this particular thing, let's go to another one. And again, I love that perspective. I learned to crack jokes as a kid because we had to survive, and that allowed some lightness into the situation. Like there's a little more air to breathe when you can crack a joke about the worst things. I don't know how to be funny when I write.
Not everybody has the instinct to write humor. Not everybody has that in their voice, but letting the peculiar in. And Sonia, I'm a big fan of your writing. Now we can pat each other on the back.
Yeah,
I've been a big fan of your writing for so many years, but you allow the peculiar in. You're not just stating things, and that's what we do as literary writers. We don't just state things the whole world has agreed on. We look at things and look for the unusual perspective. So
right. But what's your working definition of hell?
you know, if you're a miserable person, if you treat people miserably, if you act badly, you're carrying that around inside of you. And you know, just smiling at strangers and doing small kindnesses for people, or trying to be there for the people in your direct life, or really stopping to listen to your students. I don't do all of this well. I have bad days, but on my good days, you know, that's heaven. You immediately feel better when you act better. When I run across a really miserable, unkind, nasty, bully person, I think, well, it's horrible working with that person, but it would be even worse being that person. And that's my definition of hell.
Sure. Yeah, I like what you said about small kindnesses, because I don't know why it should be, but helping others, even though we might resist it at first, it almost always elevates the feeling of being connected to each other. Yeah, that's great.
It's what I hated about COVID. I just like meeting strangers and making them laugh, or meeting strangers and giving them a little bit of, you know, a nice day, because I get so much from it.
Not only are you a wonderful writer and a champion for the genre, you're just generous. And I see that so often people will call upon you to do things. And you never said no to me. And I know that that's true of other people. So you've got really good karma.
Thank you. My version of imposter syndrome.
Oh, really?
I better be really, really nice, because goodness knows I have no talent.
Are you serious? You're joking.
Oh, yeah. Some days that's true.
Wow. Okay. Because I think it's what I see is writers who can do that tend to be more confident. Like, I think when you're so busy posing or doing all this other stuff, you can't even think about what other people might need.
I have, and it's a gift, become confident as a teacher. I've learned some things that are really helpful when I pass them on to students. But that voice in my head that says my writing is just trite and predictable, it never goes away. You just fight it with every new project.
Why are we so awful to ourselves? And people do that even without religion. Somehow humans pick that up. Like, we're not okay, we're not okay, we're not okay.
Yeah.
It's just this battle. Get rid of it.
Now you'll get to hear just how good he is as Dinty reads the prologue from his wild and wonderful book.
The whole. Let's start here. In one of my earliest childhood memories, my father, a sweet, clever, funny man who drank far too much, is standing in a hole. A mechanic's pit, to be precise, a 6 by 12-foot rectangle cut 7 or so feet deep into the cement floor of the local Chevrolet dealership's repair shop. This was before the hydraulic lifts became standard. This was when a car would be brought into the garage and driven directly over the pit, when a mechanic would need to descend into the hole to access the automobile's undercarriage, to change the oil, wrench off the muffler, or adjust the springs. My father, his friends called him Buddy, was one of those mechanics, and for as long as I knew him, he dreaded the work. He hated standing in a hole all day, his blue cotton work shirt spattered with oil, grease, and metal shavings. He hated the fumes, the smells, the constant gashes and cuts on his hands and fingers. He did what he did to support his family, and frankly, to support his drinking. And he did this for nearly half his life. Or maybe better that we start a bit further back, say 3000 BC. It was about then that ancient Sumerians began to carve odd wedge-shaped symbols onto clay tablets. Once inscribed, these tablets of wet mud were left to bake under the fierce Mesopotamian sun. And they baked quite hard, so hard that a few of them remain intact to this day. The wedge-shaped symbols were an alphabet of sorts, and the surviving tablets sent warnings of a dismal, dusty underworld, a dire place where the dead drink dirt and eat stones, about as joyless as it gets. Those Sumerian slabs constitute the earliest written account of what we now call hell, the deepest of all holes, and certainly the worst. Or perhaps we should split the difference and just start here. Florence, 1308 AD. Dante Alighieri somehow got it into his stubborn Italian skull to write a book, the medieval traveler's guide to heaven, hell, and purgatory, where to eat, where to stay, what to see. Okay, that's not the actual title, but only because publishers didn't have sales and marketing departments back in the 14th century. Instead, Dante titled his book Commedia, and while the Sumerians had cleverly scrawled their vision of hell into ancient mud, Dante's odd poetic undertaking attempted something even more ambitious, carving a gruesomely vivid image of a roiling Hades into the wet clay tablet of our modern Western consciousness. And it worked. Better, I'm guessing, than the poet ever imagined. Dante's Inferno, a pulsing, perilous mixtape of Greek, Roman, and Christian myths and images, connected directly somehow to an urgent need in the human psyche to make sense of our inexplicable existence. And as a result, countless readers fell for the adventure fantasy and fell hard, mistaking Dante's imaginative hallucinations for fact, misreading his vividly horrific accounts as the honest reporting of an actual eyewitness, as if the cranky Florentine had flounced into hell with a notebook and pencil, returning 24 hours later, safe though singed, was a supernatural journalistic scoop. But he didn't, dear reader. He made it all up.
Thank you. And I think about the first time that I met you, which was like 20 years ago now. You read your essay about fatherhood, which is alphabetically arranged, and we were all blown away. And why we were blown away, besides the topic was serious, it was fatherhood, parenting, all of that. But that was the first time I think I'd heard an essay that really wove these layers together, these multi-tonal layers.
One of the things I did with this book, which ended up being very fruitful and very fun, is I forced myself to get out of my office and away from my keyboard and actually do things. So I was struggling with the idea of gluttony and why is that a sin? So I went to London, Kentucky, where Colonel Sanders from Kentucky Fried Chicken was born, and went to the World Chicken Festival and entered a chicken eating contest. I struggled with the idea of why avarice, why accumulating things was defined as a sin. And I went to the world's largest yard sale. Force yourself to go out and experience something new. New experiences bend your thinking in interesting ways. And sometimes we, as writers, need to stare at the blank page and think, or stare at the written page and rethink and revise. But sometimes we need to actually go out in the world and do things that we think somehow are adjacent to what we're wrestling with, even if we don't write about that experience. It's going to make us smarter and surprise us as writers, which is what allows us to surprise the readers.
Yeah,
that's a prompt. Is that a
no,
prompt?
that's a prompt. I think what you're saying is get off your butt and do something a little outside of your comfort zone. Doesn't have to be that you enter a chicken wing eating contest in Kentucky, but some other thing, because no matter what, it's going to bear fruit.
It's as subtle as going to an art museum and staring at paintings and while thinking about your subject. But there's a lot of other scary and fun ways to do it as well.
Yeah, really good. I admired you so much for doing that chicken wing. And that cat has a knife.
Yeah. So we have a black cat named Lucinda that captures her spirit exactly. But but back to the beginning of this interview. Life is about the contradictions.
Yes.
Things are sad and lonely, and we're full of self-loathing, and life is funny and we're ridiculous.
Yeah.
That mug kind of embodies for me, because I love the contradictions embraced in everything.
Because that's where life is. It seems to me as a writer and a reader, that's what I want. But just as a human being, that's where I'm constantly working.
You find that place where it just doesn't make sense. Stay there. That's where you're going to find your material.
It's so uncomfortable though, isn't it? hence chicken wings in
Hence
English
chicken
muffins with peanut butter, you know, whatever.
Check out the links below to order a copy of Dinty's book, to learn more about his many other books and projects, including the magnificent treasure trove of a website literary journal called Brevity. And while you're doing good deeds, hit like or click subscribe so that you're notified of new author interviews. I look forward to seeing you next time at the Memoir Cafe.